Den of the Wolfman, the novella prequel to the novel Wild River by Ronald M. Kimmons. Chapter 11. Bondus watched from across the street as dock workers started filing in for their shift. He sat at a cafe table, pretending to read a newspaper, while picking at a fish that he had ordered. He had no idea what was actually written in the newspaper, though. His greatest fear now was that the killer would realize that someone had been at his abode, and that this would scare him away. But no. Among the men that Bondus saw appearing for the shift, he recognized a specific face. Yes, this had been the face that he had seen in the vision of Eliah's death. This had been the face that he had seen in a mirror in the Wolfman's own memories. This was his man. He saw the killer swap pleasantries with a few of the other dock workers, while they all signed in at the ledger. A union representative was there at the sign-in booth, and he halted the men and started making his announcement. Bondus could not hear it, but he knew what was being said. The union was negotiating for dental care for its members, and everyone was being asked to bite down on a wax wafer to get a sense of their current dental condition. Some of the men laughed at the idea. Dental care? They didn't need that. In the end, though, they all complied, including the killer. They dunked the tongue-shaped wafers into hot water provided by the union representative, bit down on them, and then deposited them into small paper bags tagged with their names. "Good day, Mr. Riverman," said a feminine voice from Bondus's peripheral vision. He turned to have a look at the woman who stood there. She was a thin, homely woman in an unassuming blue and white printed dress. Bondus looked up at her, trying not to appear too surprised, and then stood, motioning for her to join him. "Ta'anuf sent you, did he?" asked Bondus. "He did," she said. "You can call me Orchid." "Nice name," Bondus replied. They both sat. "Is it just you?" "No," she said. "We have 2 other men in the vicinity, watching. We don't want him to get away." Bondus nodded. He glanced back toward the crowd of dock workers. The killer was staring right at him. Bondus froze. If he'd been given a split second of preparation, he would have reacted with more care. But as it was, the surprise was evident on his face. Even that was not the reason for the killer's realization, though. At that moment, with the 2 of them staring at each other from across the street, Bondus realized that the act of lying in the killer's bed the previous day had established a mental connection that went both ways. While Bondus had been dreaming of himself as the killer had likely been dreaming of himself as Bondus. The killer probably had not put everything together at first, but now, seeing Bondus sitting there and feeling the tendrils of that connection still, he had begun to understand. The killer bolted. "Curses!" shouted Orchid, and she and Bondus were both on their feet. Of course, the killer ran away from them, into the dockyards. Bondus nearly got clobbered by a team of bacalans, pulling a wagon full of barrels as he raced across the street. He then had to push his way through the crowd of dock workers, who shouted obscenities at him and stared curiously as he ran past. Bondus caught sight of his quarry as the man ran down the length of the dockyard, with workers going back and forth with their crates, barrels, and sacks. The killer was not leaving Bondus behind, but Bondus was not gaining on him either. As they continued to run, Bondus's lungs began to ache, and sweat appeared on his face. Thoughts raced through his mind. What would happen if this man were to escape? How many more would the Wolfman kill? They ran to the end of the dockyards and kept running. The killer rounded a corner, and Bondus continued after him. Bondus was reaching the limits of his stamina now. He was starting to feel nausea. His legs were burning, and he simply could not get enough air. Coming round the corner, Bondus did not see the killer anymore. Apparently he had gone into an alley. Bondus stopped running and walked toward the nearest alley opening. It was between 2 brick structures of several floors each, and it seemed almost like a world within a world, a rift of darkness in a field of daylight. Pieces of lumber, broken crates, some barrels, scraps of metal, ceramic tiles, and other random items littered the ground there. The alley terminated at a stone wall, where someone had built a structure without regard for maintaining passability in the alley. Bondus took a moment to catch his breath. He wagered that the killer was hiding in there somewhere. He could see a door on the left, but he had not heard the sound of it closing, and he suspected that it had been locked. Bondus had left his cane at the table, but he could feel the brass knuckles in his pocket. He slipped his fingers through the holes and squeezed the cold metal. He started to press forward, then hesitated, looking around. Where was Orchid with her men? He did not see them anywhere. He suddenly realized that it made no sense to try to go after the killer by himself. It seemed that the man was trapped, so time was on Bondas's side so long as it stayed that way. Bondas stood quietly for a minute. Eventually he saw a head peeking out from a hiding place behind some barrels. The killer spotted Bondas and immediately ducked away again. The action seemed juvenile, and Bondas almost wanted to laugh. "Please let me go," came a voice from the alley. Bondas's forehead furrowed at that. "Let you go?" he asked. "Why would I do that, Wolfman?" I'm not the Wolfman," he said. "Please, they'll kill me. I don't want to die." Bondas shook his head. "I know who you are. Others may not, but I do. I've been in your mind." The killer took a moment to contemplate that. He then stood and faced Bondas. He was about 12 paces away. "I didn't do those things," said the killer. "That was the other man." His tone grew cold. "If you let me go, everything will be fine," the killer continued. "If you don't get out of my way, the other man will come, and he won't be kind with you." "How many people have you let the other man kill?" asked Bondas, trying to keep him talking. "I don't know," said the killer. "Liar," said Bondas. "You know exactly how many. You kept the ribs." The killer paused. There was the sound of something dripping in the alley. 22, he finally said. 22 people, repeated Bondas. "Did you watch?" The killer's gaze dropped to the ground. "Yes, I watched." "You liked it too, didn't you?" asked Bondas. "No," he said, "I never liked it." "I've been in your mind," repeated Bondas. "I know you liked it. You liked it every time. You just didn't want to be responsible for it, so you blamed the other man." Some passers-by were taking notice now. Men and women were stopping to observe their conversation. Bondas wanted to tell them to continue on, but he knew that he had to keep his attention focused on his quarry. "The other man is you," continued Bondas. "He's just one side of you. You created him so that you could do the things you wanted without remorse." The killer came out from behind the barrels and took a few steps toward Bondas. Bondas tensed, not sure how he was going to handle it if the man came at him at full speed. "You've been in my head, but I've also been in yours a bit," said the killer. "I thought it was just a dream, but now I realize it was your life. Tell me, who is Celice? And what did you do to her?" "I have guilt. I have regret." Bondas clenched the brass in his hand until his knuckles went white. "Do you?" Inexplicably, the killer fell to his knees. "I do," he said, and the words came out as a whine. He reached out toward Bondas in supplication. "I do, I swear that I do." "Then lie on your face and let me restrain you." The killer thought about that, but did nothing. One of the spectators stepped forward. It was a middle-aged man in a gray suit. "Hey, say, chap, what is going on here?" he asked. "This is the Wolfman," said Bondas, not taking his eyes away from the kneeling figure. "The Wolfman?" asked the man in the gray suit. "Yes," said Bondas. "Go for a constable, please." About a dozen people had gathered now, and the mention of the Wolfman sent a murmur through them. The killer raised his eyes at them, and scorn contorted his face while tears streamed from his eyes. "Yes, all you proper folk in your judgment," he cried. "Do you have any idea what this man here has done?" He pointed a finger at Bondas. "And what about what you all do every day to each other? You're dogs. You're monsters. You eat each other alive, and you're proud of it. Hypocrites." "Out of my way!" came a woman's voice. Suddenly, Orchid was at Bondas's side. "There you are. Is that the man?" "Yes." "Are you sure?" "Yes." She nodded. "Be careful. He is still more dangerous than you know." The killer looked at her, and the scorn in his face turned to hatred. "You have no idea who I am, woman," he said. His face suddenly went bright red. He got to his feet. Orchid took a step back, raised a whistle to her lips, and blew it. The killer stepped forward as if to attack her, and Bondas stepped to the side to block his path. This gave the killer pause. He then turned and ran back into the alley. Reaching a door that had apparently been locked, he raised a foot and kicked through it, with wood splintering everywhere. He then disappeared inside. Bondas raced after him. "Leave me alone!" shouted the killer. "Leave me alone! Leave me alone! Leave me alone!" Bondas had expected the killer to leave through the main door of the building, but no, he had raced up the stairs instead. He was able to run upward at an alarming rate, and Bondus found it difficult to keep up, having already been winded from their long run. He couldn't understand how the killer had suddenly gotten so much energy. They ascended through several floors. The stairs led to a corridor at each level, but the killer only continued upward. Reaching the roof, Bondus pushed the door open and was greeted with the image of the killer standing on the ledge there, looking down at the people below. Again trying to catch his breath, Bondus walked toward the man. "It's peaceful up here, is it not?" asked the killer. Bondus stopped a few paces behind him and said nothing. "You can hear the sounds of the city," the killer continued. "So it feels close enough, but none of it can touch you. I imagine it is sort of like floating around as a ghost." The killer turned to Bondus. "Aren't you going to try to talk me down?" he asked. "No," said Bondus. "But I will bind your hands and take you in alive if that is what you want." The killer sat on the ledge and removed his shoes and socks, placing them neatly beside him, as if he were about to go for a swim. He then pulled the suspenders from his shoulders and began to unbutton his shirt. "I could have been something, you know," said the killer. "Yes, you could have," said Bondus. "I could have been a shift boss. I could have been a mayor. I could have been a family man. I could have been anything else." "Yes," said Bondus. The killer nodded and narrowed his eyes. "I would like to taste a woman's flesh one more time, though." Now shirtless, he stood again, regarded the people who had congregated on the street below, and then turned to Bondus. He grinned. "A man's flesh will do, though," he said. "It's not my preference, but it will do." He stepped down from the ledge and moved toward Bondus. Again the pallor of his flesh went from white to cherry red. Bondus assumed a fighting stance, his free hand forward, his hand with the brass knuckles drawn back for a punch. The killer came at him in a flash. His speed truly surprised Bondus, but Bondus still managed to deliver a solid blow right into the man's forehead. His head snapped backward from the impact, but his momentum still carried his body into Bondus. The force of that charge put them both on the floor. Bondus rolled away from him and came to his feet again, looking down on the man. The killer shook his head, a bit dazed from the blow, but was quickly on his feet. Fear took hold of Bondus. He had been in brawls before. He had seen what head trauma could do to a man. The brass-assisted punch he had just delivered, combined with the killer's own forward force, should have caused major cranial trauma, perhaps even death. It had done very little. "And now you see why I'm special," said the killer, grinning again. The door opened behind Bondus. It was Orchid and two burly men whom Bondus had not met before. "Good show, Bondus," said Orchid. "We'll take it from here." "Who are you?" asked the killer. The burly men stepped forward into the space between him and Bondus. Each of them held a machete in one hand and a revolver in the other. "We're your friends," said Orchid. She also had a revolver. "We've come to help you." "Help me?" asked the killer. Orchid took hold of Bondus's shirt, pointed to the door with her revolver, and pulled him toward it. "I need you to leave now," said Orchid. "You've done your job. You'll be paid whatever Herder promised you." At once confused, deflated, and relieved, Bondus opened the door, stepped through it, and, with one last look at the killer, left. As he descended the stairs, he could hear the sound of gunshots on the roof.